School of Rock. Santa Ana.
All right, I'm excited about today because thanks to the advice you gave me, I was able to make a quantifiable improvements to the bass videos. I got the audio to where it's actually listenable on a portable device.
Cool. You were listening to it on your phone or some mobile device, and it sounds okay. Sounds good.
Sure, or just on the little laptop speakers. And
so walk me through it. So what were you using? What did we land on?
yeah, so it was the recommended gain stages, which was basically bass amp, channel EQ, compressor, and limiter.
Okay.
And the limiter, yeah, I think that was the main factor because I'm compressing it at various stages. By the time I get to the compressor, it's kind of my ears. I can't really tell, but the limiter, it was like it sort of like tightened up right there.
Yeah. It's a great way to get it punchy. It brings everything up to the limit. I mean, you're curling over those tops of those waveforms like we talked about, and then pushing everything up closer to that. So it can be overdone. I mean, it can really crush your audio, and especially dynamics and stuff like that, because it's compressing, but when done to the right extent, it can add a lot, really make it pop.
To be truthful, I don't think in a blindfold test I could tell the difference between like really heavy compression and the limiter.
Yeah.
I think I hear them both kind of doing the same thing, which is just tightening it up,
Yeah. Well, so compression and limiting are really the same. There is no difference really between compression and limiting. Essentially, they do this, they function the same way. Limiters cut off the top, like it's a hard limit, right? So you set that top at -10 or whatever you set it at for your limiter, and it does not allow anything over that, period. So when something gets up to that level, it tucks that tip, the top of that waveform, right back underneath. It will not. It's a hard limit. So those are generally referred to as like hard limiters, So when you get to a certain volume, that's it. It cuts it off. Compression does the same thing, but it allows it a little more breathing room. So and you have other options in there like threshold, attack, release. Those you'll see it depending on the compression algorithm or program or software you're using. You'll see different options in there, but most of them have a threshold, an attack, and a release at a minimum. The threshold sets where it attacks at, like how much volume you need to trigger it to turn on. The attack is how fast it turns on, and the decay or the release is how long it stays compressed before it opens back up again to let more audio in there. And what that essentially does is, with a limiter, as we just talked about, it hits that ceiling and boom, gets tucked right underneath. There's nothing going on, right? With a compressor, when you change those settings, the audio comes up. Say you set your threshold here, right? Your limiter is going to stop everything right at -10 or whatever it is, right? With the compressor, when it gets to -10, it then triggers the attack. And so the attack then says, I'm going to wait 10 milliseconds or 5 milliseconds or 100 or wherever you set it. I'm going to wait that long before I do anything. And then there's typically a couple other settings like a knee and a ratio. And the ratio says how much it's going to compress, and the knee says how sharply it's going to compress. So with a soft knee, it's going to curve it under and find that ratio. With a sharp knee, it's going to boom, like your limiter, it's going to cut it right over and then put it directly at whatever that ratio you set is. And then the release says, I'm going to hold it at that long. As long as things are still pushing up against this wherever I set it, I'm going to keep it. And once something drops underneath that, I'm going to still hold my compression there until it's a certain amount of time, 200 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, whatever you set it to, has passed. And then I'm going to go ahead and reset those settings so that when the next waveform comes up, I go ahead and do it again. I'll reset it for that, and I'll follow that knee algorithm. I'll follow that ratio algorithm. Does that make sense?
That is quite a bit. I I have a question about the threshold then. So I'm looking here, I have a preset on the compressor called light bass,
Mm-hmm.
and the threshold is a negative 13.5 dB. So when I'm looking at a waveform and it's shooting out to, negative 50 and positive 50, does that mean it's triggering? Is that the decibels that it's talking about? Like 13.5 on either side of that visible waveform?
I'm pulling up Pro Tools right now, and we're going to take a look at a compressor real fast. I realize that I probably should have started this already, and we're going to look at a compressor. And actually, I still have that bass demo that I played for you last time, so I'm going to open that up, and we'll look at some bass under compression, and we'll talk about what the different settings on that compressor do. I'll run you through it. I wish you could share your screen. I could take you through it, and you could do it yourself. Once you get up on the laptop, then you can share your screen, and I can take you through it, so you can really hear it there in person. But for now, since we don't have that option, I'll just share my screen and you can check this out. So the threshold really is only positive dBs. It doesn't, so your waveform is not positive and negative dBs. I mean, it's modulating the frequency. It's not modulating the amplitude. What happens is when it gets up to a certain space, I mean, it is the same on both sides. A waveform is the same on both sides. I mean, the amplitude is the same both ways. Here, let's zoom in here a little bit.
Yeah, what is it that I'm looking at when I'm looking at a waveform? What is that telling me?
That's telling you, how loud that signal is. It's telling you how far that's going. And because waves go up and down and back and forth, that's going to give you the, it's because, so waves are, symmetrical, right? They go up and they go down evenly. So that amplitude is up and down, and that's actually, we can get into all of that sort of later. But that's what creates the I just blanked on the effect name, but not synchronization. The polarity, and that's so when you reverse the polarity on something, you're turning around the positives and negatives. So that's how wave cancellation works, actually. So you remember when Nate would set up those rear firing subwoofers, right? Like that's how it works, wave cancellation. So what you're using is, so you have one wave that's coming in. I think Nate actually explained it to us really well before, and this is sort of a basic understanding of it. But as the wave is coming, it's up and down, and it's cycling, right? So what you're doing with the rear firing subwoofer or speaker or whatever it is, you are canceling out that wave with a wave that's opposite of, has the opposite polarity. So as this wave goes up, this wave goes down exactly at the same time. And what that does is it effectively sucks the top and the bottom down to where it's at zero. It evens out. And it happens on guitars. They do it on purpose. Actually, they reverse the polarity of some of the when you use different pickup selector positions, it inverts the polarity of the pickup, and then your waves are fighting against each other and provides this like hollow sound to a guitar.
It's the in phase, out of phase.
Is phase. You got it. Exactly. That's the word I was looking for. Not polarity. Phase. So the phase is thank you. So the phase is that. So as the wave is coming up and the other wave is coming down, they are out of sync with each other. It is the exact same sound signal. It has to be the same exact signal. It can't be different or modified in any way. And they will cancel each other out exactly. If they're modified in some way, like you have EQ on this sound and not EQ on this sound, because of the differences in the frequencies that are existing in those waves, there will be a large amount of cancellation, but it will not be silent. In order for silent, it has to be the exact same wave. And that's how that cancellation works.
So what is it telling me when I'm looking at my waveforms and they're not totally, so they tend to trend towards being more in the positive or more in the negative or something like that?
Well, I'm not sure. Hold on. Let me see if I know, if I can see what you're talking about here. So here's our waveform. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. And this is generally what they look like. So this is a bass waveform that I made. I mean, I created this. And here's your little waves, right? They go up,
Let's see.
they go down and up, and they have this little bump, and they have a down and up. And so what's happening is this is an acoustic instrument. It's an electric instrument because I recorded it. It's electric. But it's essentially an acoustic sound. In other words, it's not a computer generated sound. So when you get into synthesizers, you can make an exact and perfect waveform that is exactly a sine wave, sawtooth wave, triangle wave, square wave. I mean, they have all of these different things that synthesizers produce, and they produce exactly perfect sine waves. What you're seeing in these little bobbles and these little bumps here is that's how the string is vibrating. So the string is largely vibrating back and forth, as you can see, in this symmetrical way, more or less. But because it's an actual stringed instrument, it's an actual real acoustic vibrating string. You get these little dips, and you get these little things that go in between. And you can notice actually that those ones are as well sort of symmetrical, and not symmetrical, but repeating. So you see this same kind of repeats again and again, and then this top is kind of the same again and again. And so that's the cycle. That's what creates the frequency cycle that makes the sound, the timbre of this specific instrument, is how those waves are changed right there. If it was perfect, if it just went down and up, down and up, down and up, it would be a computer generated tone, or it would be it would sound perfectly at that frequency, and it would not have any of those variations that make it sort of interesting. Not that synthesized music is not interesting. It gives the artifacts are what give it the timbre that it has, the sound that it has.
So like part of it, when I'm looking towards the end of this wave, it appears that there's it spikes, not the very end, somewhere before that probably. There's a trend, from there on out, that it's a little higher above zero than below zero.
Yeah, so when you talk about it, and it's great, man, talking about synthesizers, right? So in synthesizer terms, they call it ADSR, which stands for attack, which is what happens here, how the sound starts, decay, how quickly it comes down from that peak. How fast does it come down? Here's your peak right here. How fast does it come down? That's your decay. Sustain, ADS, S is sustain. How long does that last then? How long does this taper last? And then the release. When does it actually shut off? When does that stop? So in synthesizer terms, it's called ADSR, and that's a great way. I mean, it doesn't have to be synthesizer. That's just how it's often referred to in synthesization, synthesis. That's how it's often referred to is always referred to in synthesis, because that's how waveforms work. There's an attack, there's a decay, there's a sustain, and there's a release. And that's how waveforms ADSR, yes, correct. There's actually a channel that I follow on Facebook called ADSR, and indeed it's about synthesizers and how synths work, and they also post photos and cool stuff.
What about that channel you follow called ASM?
I follow EDM. I don't know about AS. I don't know about that one. I don't have any knowledge of anything.
Okay.
So does that make sense? Does that answer your question about sort of waveforms and how that works? So basically what you're talking about when you're talking about compression, and again, looking at this waveform, so here's what happens with this wave. So the threshold sets how high this peak has to be in order for that to kick on, right? When does the compression start? Because it can't compress down here. Like, for instance, on the end of this, it can't compress down here. There's nothing to compress. I mean, if you were compressing this, you compress it down to nothing, right? There wouldn't be anything there. There'd be no sound. Right. So it has to cross some sort of threshold, and that's what this is. This is where your threshold. So say we set our compressor at, I don't know, actually, I don't see any numbers here, but say we set our compressor, say this peak is 5 dB, and we set our compressor to turn on at 3 dB. So it would turn on right here. So it would take that peak and it would bring it down to wherever 3 dB is. Let's say it's right here, but it would do it at a rate of however long this is. So if this was a compressed waveform, which it is not, but just as an example, if this was a compressed waveform, this would go up to the threshold. It would trigger here at this threshold, and then the attack speed would say how long it would take for it to bring it down to this level. So attack would actually be, it would be at this peak level for, millisecond or however long we set it for. And then the ratio would kick in and the knee would kick in, and that would tell us when it would. So this looks like it has a very short attack, right? So the attack turns on as soon as it spikes. The attack turned on. It had sort of a mild ratio because it compressed it. It didn't compress it super fast. It didn't go down really fast. It went tapered. Okay. So it had sort of a tapered compression, a kind of a smaller ratio, probably 1:4 or something. Again, this is not a compressed sound. I'm just making this up as an example. So the ratio is something like 1:4, and it did it over this amount of time. So this is, the knee was very slow. It sloped it down here. It didn't sharply cut it off, and the compression ratio was pretty mellow. And so it shut it down here, and then here is where our threshold is. So we set our threshold here, and then after the sound dropped below the threshold here, then the compressor doesn't turn off. It stays on, but you don't notice it because it's underneath that threshold. So the compressor stays on as long as you have the release setting. However long your release setting is, the compressor will stay on for that long. But once the sound dips under that, the compressor then is not working anymore. It just means that whereas as this sound, it triggered the knee, triggered the ratio, and then came back down. At this point, the release was not yet released, and this for some reason spiked. Like we hit it again, we targeted it. We hit this string again. It was another note or another attack. It would not do this taper. It would immediately react and immediately bring it down to the same ratio where it was, because it would not have released yet. And the release means resets back to 0. Does that all sort of make sense?
It does. I'm just wondering, because my compressor doesn't have a release control.
Here, let's take a look at it real quick. So this is the compressor that I use. Let's see, I don't even really know. Okay, here I was using, this is just a standard, I was using just the regular Pro Tools compressor. I don't know if yours looks similar. You're using GarageBand, right?
Yes.
So it should look similar to this, although, they have different functions and different things, okay? And so what's happening here is, here's our, it starts over here with the gain and the threshold. So the threshold is here. That sets where it's going to kick in at. Here's your attack. That's how fast.
Where's your threshold set at to default?
I don't know. Probably negative 37-ish. I actually don't know where it's set at to default. Let's see. So if I switch this, so it has a bunch of presets. Let's see. So let's see, I had it set to the bass guitar. So the bass guitar preset sets it at negative 35 dB.
Negative 35.
That's the preset. So here,
that's fair to say that that's not a great deal of compression. That's pretty moderate. You're not really squashing it.
So what's fair to say about that is that has nothing to do with the amount of compression. It has only to do with how much level is let through before the compression kicks in. That's not actually the amount of compression. It's how much audio it takes to trigger the compression.
Okay. Oh, I see. So you could actually, if the only tool I had to work with was the threshold, I could sort of affect how much it's working just by messing with the volume control. Like, as I'm cranking up the master and letting more sound in, it would be doing a bit more.
Right, absolutely. So what happens with the compressor is, the more audio you push into it, the more compressed and more condensed it gets, because it's not letting you got no more headroom up there. It's compressing all of that. So you're just basically bringing the bottom stuff up, and you're giving it this narrow band of dynamics to function in.
Yes. So what I wonder is, how is it, I suppose the obvious answer is by listening, but how do you know what's a reasonable ratio to?
Let's check it out. So I don't actually know how loud this is going to be. I'm going to turn this down. I don't know where we're at here with this. Oh, okay, there it is. So can you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's just so this is actually the raw audio, because this is bypassed. It's not actually working. This is what it would be doing. So this is showing you what it would be doing, but Pro Tools has this nice bar over here that shows that actually it's not compressing. It's not doing anything. It's off. So it's bypass mode. So this is just the audio as it is. And we'll just leave it right at 0 dB there, or right about 0 dB. So this is nothing, but it does show you what's happening here. So this little red dot, that is the audio signal. That is tracking the peak level of the audio, the input source. And that is what this threshold is gonna affect, right? So what we're saying here is, as I'm raising the threshold, I'm saying that things that are above that, that's how it triggers. So now if I set the threshold really high, notice nothing happens. There's no compression at all. It's just, we're just tracking this little white dot going up and down because it's set to 0 dB, and indeed the audio does not reach 0 dB. So we're triggered.
And now by setting it high, you mean further away from 0, like -40, -50. That's high thresholds. Right?
So actually that's the opposite. So as you set it closer to 0, think about the sound right here. So think about the sound. As you set it closer to 0, you're allowing more of that headroom. You're raising it. So the threshold, as you set it -5, -10, -20, -30, you're pushing down the level where it triggers. So if your bass signal is at, and again, remember we're talking about digital, so 0 is the top. We don't have anything above 0. 0 is the top amount of gain that you can have for digital clipping, right? So if your bass is operating at, over here, around -20, -15, you aren't going to hear any compression at all because you're set your compressor at 0. Okay, so as you set your compressor to 5, then anything that hits 5, it works. If you set it to -10, -10, anything that hits -10 works. Anything that hits -15, then it starts, and so on and so forth. So the larger the negative number, so at -10, it's going to work less than at -15, and it's going to work less than at -20. So -20, it would trigger right away. It would trigger at a softer input level. Does that make sense?
Yes. And now I should be able to see this. I should somehow be able to look at the waveform, see that I've got a lot of waves up and down below, like -25 or something, and maybe set my threshold for -20.
You got it. So take a look here. So we're looking at our mix window here. And as I watch this bass play, Pro Tools has this nice little line that shows up at your peaks, okay? So we're peaking right around 15, right around 10, somewhere between 15 and 10, okay? So that's where we're peaking. And if we go back to our edit window here and we zoom out a little bit, let's go zoom out here. Now we can see, I started it over here, wherever the start of this file is. So here's where we started. So that's -10, that's between -10 and -15. So I can look now across that waveform and I can say, oh yeah, that's pretty much where we're at. Here it's a little bit lower. So maybe I'd want to check this out for a different set maybe of compression, or make sure I'm considering that when I'm using my compression. But also here are our huge peaks, right? Like then here are our big peaks. So something also need to do, if once we get a little further down the line, once you're a little happier with your basic compression, is then you need to go in and make sure that your compression settings work here when it's quieter, and that they work here when it's louder. So like if you're going to compress everything on one channel, you have to understand that these are going to get compressed more and these are going to get compressed less. And if you want that compression sound, the sound that you set here may not work for here. So there are some tricks and things you can do to make that work, but that's just a consideration. Just because you set the compression for this section of audio doesn't mean that this section of audio is going to need that exact same amount. It's going to sound a little bit different because it's not going to be compressed as much as this one because it's just naturally a quieter section.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah? Does that answer your question?
Yes. Does it seem like when you record your guitar is -15 dB like a regular? Does that seem like a standard amount?
For an input source, it depends a little bit. Okay. So it depends on the input source. Drums are going to have really high transients, and they're not going to have a lot of meat to the sound, right? If you think about it, drums are like bah, and then it's over, right? Like you have a very, very quick attack, and then the decay is also pretty quick. The sustain is like nothing, and the release is almost right away. I mean, it's a hit. It's a percussive sound, right? If you think about a legato guitar or a long bass tone, you probably have maybe a spike at the beginning. You know, you might have an initial attack, but that's going to sustain for a very long period of time, right? Because you're playing long notes, you're playing long tones. So the way that you compress those two different instruments is very different because of the way that the waveforms are going to look. So I say that to preface this by saying, when I record guitar, I want to make sure that the meat of the notes is you know, in a workable area. So this is pretty quiet here, but this is bass. Once I get through EQing it and compressing it and making it, as long as this input source is good and it sounds good, this is not an unreasonably quiet amount of volume. Now, I did this kind of quickly, so you know, ultimately I would want it a little bit louder, but you know, even something that's pretty quiet, as long as you're you know, we'll look over here in the mix window to see these, you know, 0 dBs up here, but you can hear, you know, if I'm recording down here at -20, -15, I can affect that sound enough with compression and stuff that as long as that input source is clean and good and doesn't have like background hiss and background noise, I'm going to be able to make that sound really good and fit into the mix. The other thing is if you're mixing a solo instrument or you're mixing a band. So in a band, each individual instrument is going to add up to this really large sound. So if every instrument in your band recording is recording at, you know, +6 or 0 dB or something, I mean, all of that adds up really quick. So you're going to be ending up taking away volume from each of those channels because it's just going to overpower the whole thing altogether. It's going to create too much of a sound. You're going to probably get digital clipping, you know. So to have the meat of your sound when you're recording, you know, piano, bass, or guitar, something, a voice, you know, where you're going to have these long sections. You want the meat of that. You want to really focus on the meat of that to make sure you're getting what you need in those volumes, especially if it's a breathy vocal like we talked about last time, or if it's, you know, an acoustic instrument or something. You want to make sure you can hear those tapers and those sections where they cut off. I mean, that's really important to the overall sound. And once you get that at a pretty good level, you also have to consider the high side, which is, you know, how high are my transients, you know? And it may be that, you know, in an acoustic guitar setting, you have to mess with your compression and mess with the settings to the point where you can nip those transients, those really large transients, before they clip, before they would come up here, while still maintaining these middle sections in this nice breathy open. That's why acoustic instruments and stuff can be difficult to get right, because you really want to have the meat of that sound is very important. You want to hear that. That's really important to the sound, but you also cannot you don't want those transients to be spiking up here above 0, especially, but even too high up here. You know, if these spikes were up here and this section was still down here where it is, I mean, think about the difference in those levels, you know? So you're compressing this a lot, and then when you get to this sound, the compression doesn't even really work, you know? It just sort of turns off. And there are ways to deal with that, and you can, but ultimately you would like to have a pretty consistent sound throughout you know, the sections, either the verse. I mean, sometimes the chorus is louder than the verse or whatever, you know, I mean, you get sections, but you should have a pretty consistent waveform. That's really the key is consistency, so that when you're using these effects, when you're using compression, when you're using EQ and that kind of stuff, you can use it to great effect if you have, you know, consistency in that sound where it's going to work evenly over the course of at least a verse or a chorus. I mean, you know, ideally a whole song, but you know, if you could at least get these sections that kind of sound good or sound even together, then it makes that the effects process, the tailoring the sound process a little bit easier. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Is it fair to say that mostly the limiter can really take care of those spikes, the what you're calling transients?
Yeah, but, you know, depending on how, you know, you're not going to necessarily have a limiter on each channel, first of all. And secondly, when you're if you did use a limiter on each channel, you're now compressing all of those dynamics on all of those channels. And then you're adding a limiter maybe at the end too. So you got to think about how much through the signal chain you're affecting that sound. You know, if every that you're using has this limiter on it and you're having to cut those, ultimately, really the answer that, you know, is tough to hear is that you didn't record it very well. You know, you didn't really dig in when the setup this stuff, the in the box stuff, or even if you have outboard gear, the post production process is very important. Nothing is more important than what you record, like the input sound. You know, if you have a signal that is just wild all over the place, doesn't sound good when you record it, you know, whatever the settings were wrong or the mic wasn't placed right or whatever, it is very difficult to impossible to compensate for poor recording with, you know, EQ and effects and that kind of stuff. It's just, it doesn't really work that way. You can make it better, but it's like polishing a turd, you know, like you can make it shiny, but you know, it's not really worth much, you know. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So that's threshold. So do we kind of have an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about threshold then?
Yes.
Cool. And so we had it at negative, I don't know where it was. We just used this preset here, which was 35, negative 35, which that seemed to be. So now we're playing, again, it's bypassed right now. We're playing the sound. So, you know, this is our loud section. And so we really want to consider also that at our quiet section, it's going to be a little bit different. So when we get to this part where it's a little bit quieter, now see how much this is working. This is basically compressing every note, right? This is basically compressing every single note that comes through. But now watch what happens. Now when we come to this part, it's a little quieter. Now we see some of the notes aren't all red. Some of them do go down under here. So we have to consider what it is that the point of our compression is. What are we trying to do with our compression? Do we want to hear that heavy compressed sound, or do we want it to be more natural, or what is it that we'd like? You know, for me, you know, I think this works pretty good. I'm not, you know, again, this isn't the best source necessarily, but
I'd back you up for a second. So if hypothetically you set it to like negative 0.1, or we're able to set it literally at 0, that would not be capturing anything under the compressor?
So look what happens there.
I can't see that there.
Oh, you can't see? Can you
well, I mean, I see it's too small for me to tell.
Oh, I got you. I'm sorry. So let me see. Can you see this a little bit better? Let's go to the next one now. Can you see this over here?
Yeah.
So so now I'm sorry. Let me turn the gain down on that. So here you can see these levels going up and down.
Yeah.
You can see this bar that's next to it, right? This bar here. So that bar is the compression, and that represents how much compression we have going on. So right now we have none because our threshold is here. So notice as I set the threshold down farther, now we start to see the compressor work. You see that orange bar?
Yeah.
Representing the compressor working. That is how much it's compressing the sound at the top, okay? And that has to do with threshold.
You're headed towards 0 right now.
No, I'm headed towards negative numbers. I'm headed towards negative 60, I guess this one goes down to. So at negative 60, you don't hear anything because it's compressing the entire sound, and I don't have the gain set up at all. As we get closer to 0, closer to the top. So remember, 0 is the top, and negative numbers are all down underneath that. 0 is the top. 0 is unity gain. You know, so it's got a couple different names, but basically in digital terms, 0 is as loud as you can possibly be. There's nothing on the other side of 0. It's called digital clipping, and it's terrible. We talked about it last time. It's not like analog. It's not like you get this nice warm distortion sound. You just get trash. It sounds really, really bad. And so here's what happens. Okay, so we set our threshold up here, and here this is going to be digital clipping. This is not going to sound good at all, but just as an example. So when we push this up and we push the gain up, okay, so you notice as we go over 0, you see these lights light up. I'm not going to do it for very long. It's not good. Yeah. But these lights light up, and that means that's it. You've gone over, and now you're in 0. You're over 0 dB. This is little red LED light. Everything's pissed off. Like they're just like.
But so that was you pushing the fader past 0. But what if the compressor threshold is at 0?
Oh yeah, you can't really. It doesn't go. So the threshold at 0, it doesn't work. You know, there's nothing you can do. As soon as you get over 0, it clips.
Right.
and it is a sound, but it's not generally considered a pleasant sound.
Okay.
So do we understand? So gain is really afterwards. So gain is what the gain knob is for, is because when you're compressing, think about it, you're taking the tops, those peaks, and you're bringing them down. So you're reducing the overall level of the signal, of the sound. So in order to make up for that, you have to then put a little bit extra gain on the back end of it. So it's input, compressor, and then the compressor has a gain at the end of the compressor, most of them do, to turn up that volume, because now you need to make up the actual level of the compression of the signal, because you've compressed it now lower than where it was at before.
So my gain control, you're right, is at the end of the compressor, and it has a range of negative 20 dB to positive 50 dB.
Okay.
Why would that be, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so you can turn the sound down. You can just turn the actual gain down and just turn the level of the level down, or you can turn it up. And the reason it goes to 50 is because now we're not talking about zero unity. Really, zero unity gain is only really on like the actual output of the sound. Sometimes the faders, and indeed even these faders here, go, these are at 0 here, and then the next one is positive 6 and positive 12. So you can push it past, 0. That's why 0 is, it's kind of weird. It is a little bit esoteric, but unity gate, like 0 digital, is clipping. There's nothing past 0. So that's output. That's your output. There's nothing past 0 in a digital output.
Yeah. So golly, this preset had gain negative 3.5 dB. It was actually cutting my gain slightly.
It can, yeah. It depends on how you have your compressor set. So really that gain is just what is often referred to as makeup gain. And it's really there to make up for the fact that you're taking out those higher levels. You're reducing the overall level of the signal. And so gain at the end is to make up that. So if you had your peaks here at, negative 20 or wherever we were, and then now you compressed it below negative 20, you need to use that makeup gain for that extra 5 dB, 10 dB, however much you compressed it, you're losing that dynamic rate, that level on the top, you're bringing that overall down. So in order to compensate for that, you need a little bit of what is commonly referred to as makeup gain.
Okay. Again, I find it hard to know, like, how do I know when this stuff is right? Because especially in the area of makeup gain, it just seems like that's something I could fudge by, turning up the volume,
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I will tell you, there is no right answer. There is no way that I can't give you a magic bullet on that one. Have great ears, and that's really going to be your best friend. You're going to be listening for clipping. You're going to be listening for where it sits in the overall mix. If you're doing it, if it's just a solo instrument, as you record a lot of solo bass, then you really just want to maximize your sound. You really want to just maximize the range and the frequency that you have, and make sure that everybody can hear all the different parts of the bass. That's the most important part. So it depends on, if it's a solo instrument, if it's a band, if it's, acoustic trio, if it's all mic'd, if it's all digital, if it's digital music, if it's synthesized music, it's all going to change how you use these tools. This is really more of trying to get you an overview of what they do and how they function, so that you can go in and mess around with it. So I guess the final answer is experimentation. That's how you mess with it until you figure out, you figure out what all these buttons do, and then you just go in there like the kid in the candy store and figure it out,
Well, I've seen tutorials on this stuff, but I think I don't have enough background information. Like, they just say stuff. They're like, they might say a statement, and that would be the point where I really need clarification. But of course,
What
I have it right in front of me. So.
Hey man, that's why you need a teacher or a mentor or something. I mean, and certainly I enjoy this stuff. I did study it in school at Berkeley a bit. I did take some recording arts classes. I've always been interested in it. Really, that's, I like it. I study it. I've got books on the subject, and I watch a lot of stuff. But the main thing to get better at anything is doing it, jumping into it. And you're right. It does help to have the background. It does help to have somebody take you through it and like show you. But then once you know the basics, the understanding, like then, you go play with it and see what happens. I mean, not going to break anything necessarily, I mean, it's not like you're mixing for Beyonce here or whatever, like no multi-million-dollar platinum record is hinging on us,
Sure.
Signal right here,
I mean, I'm sure you know the phenomenon, but when I like go to extremes to try to tell like what something does, it basically, what it winds up compressing is my ears.
Yeah.
Then I can't tell the difference between anything in the middle anymore,
That's a real thing, man. Ear fatigue is absolutely, I mean, dude, sometimes, yeah, when you get to the point where you're tweaking on a knob from all the way left to all the way right or whatever, extreme to extreme, and you can't hear the difference, take a break.
Right.
Because your ears are just you're not hearing. And that is just human nature. We cannot continue, you get burned out on certain sounds. After listening to a frequency for a certain amount of time, your body's really good at adapting to it. Like the fire alarm, for instance, or you ever hear like just this high-pitched whine or something, and after a few minutes, you don't hear it anymore. And it's the same thing. You could have that high-pitched whine in the background of your mix, and you don't even hear it. And then you mix it down about, I mean, dude, I've made all the mistakes, and certainly this one several times. It's like you bounce all the stuff down, you get it, you put it in your car, and it's like unlistenable, like people are like, this is, how do you know? Or like I left the metronome on, I've done that a number of times, and you get it into somewhere else and listen to it on a different set of speakers, because that helps. I'll switch, if I'm doing long mastering sessions or mixing sessions or recording sessions, I'll switch headphones, speakers, different set of headphones, speakers, different set of headphones, and that works to try and, mix it up. That's not really, anyway, whatever. But that's a good technique to sort of keep yourself in the zone, at least in the beginning when you're getting raw tracks and recording and that kind of stuff, and you're not really listening for specific frequencies. But yeah, man, I mean, I've definitely like left metronomes on or left random sounds in the background. And then you hear it somewhere else and you're like, dang it.
Leaving the metronome on is an easy fix,
Back, you got to bounce it all down, and then like, I mean, if you're using limiters and stuff at the end, right? So I'm using all this stuff at the at the end of the compression chain or wherever I'm doing, and that's all done with the so I mean, it's not a big deal, but that click is hitting that limiter, hitting that compressor, it's hitting that thing, so it does change the overall sound slightly,
Yeah. Oh man, that's got to be frustrating. Hey, can we skip ahead to the limiter?
Oh man, trying to get to the end of the book, huh?
Well, so I guess, yeah, so the channel EQ, I do want to talk about that, but we did skip the amp and the channel EQ in my line here and went straight to this limiter.
Yeah, one more thing about the compressor here, though. I just want to make these other, because these other attack and release are fairly easy to understand, and I think you have a good concept of that, right? Like attack is how fast it rolls that sound under, and release is how long it takes before it resets. But the knee and the ratio, do you have those on your compressor? Those are pretty important. You should at least have a ratio.
I've got a ratio. So I've got, in this order, threshold, ratio, attack, gain.
Yeah, absolutely. That's not necessarily the order that it's getting processed in, but it does. So, but that's pretty good. The ratio has to do with how far. So here, we're going to go over this real quick, and the ratio is really important. So I just want to hit on this real quick. So check out this sound and see what happens when I change the ratio. Okay, so I set our threshold to -19, so it's going to work really, you're going to see a lot of working. I'm setting it down. The attack is really fast, so it's going to work really quickly. So we're going to get a lot of compression, but I just want you to see what happens when I change the ratio. Okay, so check this out. So here's with the ratio set to 1:1. So 1:1 ratio means it's not compressing at all. Okay, so there's no compression basically, because 1:1 means when you get a signal of 1 in, it gives you a signal of 1 out. That's what that means. Okay, so you get 1 in, 1 out. So I got 1 in and I'm giving 1 out. That's it. Nothing's happening. Okay. I'm going to change the ratio and I'm going to go 2. Well, we'll do 3:1. It's not an exact science. Let's try something real easy. Let's try 2:1. 2:1 is pretty. Let's see. I think I'm running too many programs at once. So here was about 2:1. So here's about 2:1. So you'll notice what it does is it takes this little dot that's going back and forth and it rides it down a little bit on this line. And can you see this line here?
Yes.
As I crank up the ratio, look what happens to that line.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so what do you think that's doing, right? That's telling it that when you get, so now it's at 19-1. When I get an input of 1, I'm reducing that by 19. Okay. So I got 1 in and I'm doing 19 out. And it's a little weird because we were talking about negative numbers earlier, now it's sort of positive, but just think about when I'm getting 1 input in, I'm always talking about 1 input. So it's always 1. The denominator is always going to stay 1. Then
now, when you say getting 1 in, you mean 1 above wherever you set the threshold.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's a little misleading. What I mean is just like wherever you hit the threshold at, that's okay. So this, where it crosses this orange line, that's 1. That's why it's in a ratio and not in a specific number. Because when I turn the threshold up, that's still 1 here. You know, wherever it crosses that threshold line, that's where 1 starts. That's where our 1 is.
So if your ratio was 1-to-1, it wouldn't make any difference where you set the threshold. You wouldn't hear any variation.
I'll set the threshold all the way down to 60. You're still going to hear it because there's no compression. 1-to-1 is I get 1 and I send out 1.
Okay. Okay.
At 1 to, this goes up to 1 to, I don't know, 100 or something. At 1 to 100, that's like as hard as you can go. So it 1 in and then immediately sends it to negative 100. Or, I mean, it's not negative 100, but it compresses it 100 times. It's a ratio, right? It compresses it 100 times to where it got the input signal. So you can think of it as, I mean, it's not really, but like percentages. So you're compressing it 1%, which is 1/1, which is 1, which is nothing, right? And then you compress 2/1, so 2% compression, 2/1. Then you're compressing it just a little bit. Now you're compressing 4%, 5%. Now you're compressing 16%, 20%. Now you're compressing 100% of that signal it gets 100% compression.
So it seems like this is the area where you really could get like maybe some bass players, or probably everybody's familiar with that compressed tone, that compressed sound when you're hearing the compressor maybe in a way you don't want to, and this would probably be the culprits.
Yeah, the ratio and the attack speed as well. Those are going to be sort of your culprits there. If you set the attack speed too slow, it's not going to taint it, and it depends on the instrument again. Like if you're getting a lot of transients like on drums, setting your attack speed slow, you're not compressing anything, because by the time the compressor kicks in, the transient's over and nothing's happening there, right? You know, that's a little on the release because you can trigger anyway, but think about it that way. If you have just a transient like a drum and you set the attack too long, you're never going to catch any of those transients because they happen too fast, you know? Whereas with the bass, if you set the attack so on a drum, you'd want it short so it catches those and catches them as they come up, right? But on a bass, if you compress it too much, if that attack is too fast, you're going to hit that threshold really fast and it's going to kick that under. But with a bass, you really want it to wah, you know, you want it to kind of expand and drop, you know, you want that sound over time, right? You want a little bit of the attack and then some decay. You don't want it to just attack, trigger, squash. You know, you want it to attack, okay, you know, over a little time, and then we're going to release, you know, like you don't want it to squash right away.
So is it true that if I had a really high ratio and a very fast attack, like let's say an attack of 0 milliseconds,
that's a limit.
I'm getting as close as the compressor can get me to just creating like a flat wave?
That's basically what you're talking about is a limiter. So a limiter is a compressor with the ratio set to infinite or 100 or whatever, however high it goes, it's set as high as it possibly goes. The attack is as fast as it possibly can be, and then it just sets the threshold. That's basically what a limiter is. You're setting your ratio on a compressor as high as you possibly can, and you're setting the attack really fast, and then that's it. You're just cutting everything off above that level.
Gotcha.
Compressors and limiters are not different. It's the functionality, it's how they work that changes them. They basically do the same thing, but it's how they function that changes what they do. Does that make sense? I mean,
yes, it does. I'm seeing these differently because they were, previously they were just, 4 knobs on the compressor here. Now I realize that, yeah, it's kind of misleading just to look at them.
Yeah. Well, it's not necessarily intuitive, but I think you're getting a handle on what that stuff does. And now I think you can maybe play with it a little more purposefully, right? Understand a little more what it does.
Yes. Well, it's really, especially with the makeup gain, it's really a bummer that you can't see it affect the wave because, I mean, that's what you'd really want to see is like, what is that wave like? Can I beef it up again now that I've, picked my threshold?
So we can, by setting this to, hold on a second. We're going to set this to a bus, and then we're going to send this bus over here. What did I set that to? 11, 12.
I mean, I guess that's it, right? Is I could do some recordings with the plug-in, with the plug-in compressor running, and that's how you do this, right?
It's exactly what we're about to do right now. So I have now set this channel to record. Here, let's blow this up a little bit. So this channel is going to record the audio that we play. So here's with no compressor at all. It's just basically going to record the same level that I had, right? So now it's recording, right? There's no compressor. And then here's the compressor. And here's our makeup gain. And here's our ratio. And those little tapers will get longer. And here's our threshold. We're going to set the threshold down. Yeah? And that's how you can.
So what I want to say is once you hit that makeup gain, and I'm looking at what looks like a much healthier wave file. Is that just a silly thing to say? Is there such thing as a healthy looking wave file? Like it looks loud, it looks robust,
This. So what's happening, and just because, okay, so check this out here. I'll make it even more blatant. We'll do it even more blatant. Check this out. So we're going to leave the compressor off, and we're going to just have the natural sound, okay? And then we're going to pump our gain up. I'm not going to do this for very long. We're going to pump our gain up really high. And I'll show you what's going on here, and why you can't trust the waveform. I'll show you why. Here, check this out. Okay, so here's nothing. Okay, this is just the sound as it is. Now we're going to turn on our compressor.
That's with the gain dimed.
Right.
And where was the threshold at when you clicked it on?
So here's the trap that you can fall into, and I just want to make this real clear real quick before we move on to anything else. Okay, here's the trap you can fall into. So while this may look like it is a very loud signal, and it doesn't clip. It doesn't go all the way up to 0 here in the waveform, or it doesn't look like it does, right? Mm-hmm. I was pushing the gain and the threshold here in the compressor, and the audio sound does clip. So if you listen to it, okay, and even here, and I turn that down a little bit because it's not particularly great, but even here, where it's middle of the road, right? Like this looks like a pretty healthy audio signal looking at the waveform, right?
Yeah.
But listen. There's digital clipping artifacts in there, okay? So, right, because we had the artifact came in here at the compressor level, we clipped at the compressor. So even though this audio signal doesn't look like it's clipping, the sound on the track is clipping. So you really, the moral here is you can't really look at your the size or depth or whatever you want to think about of your waveform does not equate to a quality, healthy, usable sound. Not at all. This only tells you the overall level of whatever wave is in there. It doesn't tell you the quality of it. It doesn't tell you any details about what it sounds like. I mean, what instrument it could be, what anything. It doesn't tell you anything about it. So you could have a very loud signal like this, which is super loud, but is obviously clipping because you can see the tops there. Or you can have like this that doesn't really look like it's clipping. But if you listen to this at a lower volume and you don't hear that distortion, when you get to the limiting stage, when you get to the end and you want to pump up that volume, listen to what you're pumping up. So as I come in here to my mix, right, and now I want to make that louder, although it does not clip, it doesn't clip. Wow. It sounds like it clips, right? Because the sound, the actual recorded audio does clip. So the waveform, it's not useless information, but it's not particularly useful information. And very much like audio and sound and music in general, you have to really rely on your ears. You have to have a good sound. So even, you know, you could have a healthy audio signal from a bass like this, even if this wasn't distorted, say, but maybe the mic was in the wrong place. I'm getting way too much low end, or I'm getting way too much high end, or now, you know, I can't hear it necessarily when it's quiet, but there's, you know, like here, I have a fan in the background, and in between in these little quiet sections, maybe I can hear that fan, or, you know, here somebody says something on the mic, and none of that information will show up on the waveform. This only depicts the loudest and softest parts of whatever you recorded. It has nothing to do with quality. It has nothing to do with timbre, sound, frequency, nothing other than just level.
Okay.
So the moral is, and what I'd like to take away from that is, don't rely on the waveform at all. It doesn't really matter. You know, this is a little quiet, but that really, you know, if I was going to record and this was my recording level, two things. One, if I had control over the session, if it's my session, I'm going to go see why that's so low. I'm going to go through my gain stages and say, hey, you know, maybe my mic gain's not right. Maybe it's not close enough. Maybe something happened. Maybe it's not where it needs to be. I like to see it more in this range here. I do not want it here. That's too loud. Even if this did not clip, that's too loud. I don't really want this, depending on what it is. I mean, I guess drums, it's very instrument specific, but generally speaking, I want it to sort of ride in this range, you know, somewhere in here. Like, that's pretty good. That's a really healthy audio signal. There's nothing wrong with that. This is a little low, and I would think maybe there's something in my chain that's messed up. If I don't have any control over it, I'm going to just hope and pray and wish and cross my fingers that there's no artifacts, there's no background noise, there's no hiss, hum, whatever in this sound, so that I can pump that level up and it's still going to be clean audio. So if this, you know, even at this level or even quieter, if it's clean audio, if there's no background noise, no interference, none of that stuff, that's fully usable. I can bring that level up, no problem at all. Because I can use makeup gain. I mean, I have lots of makeup gain stages. You know, it's you know, when it's low, it can be delicate to get it right. You know, but it's fully usable as long as the audio source is clean. So it goes back to what I said earlier. And really, the key to recording in general is your audio source determines how good your final product can be. And there are absolutely ways to change that. There's lots of great effects out there, and you can use a pretty crummy audio source to good effect. You know, if you're a good engineer, if you're good, you can mix a lot of that stuff out, but you wouldn't have to if you had a better recording. So that's why source audio makes a huge difference. And that's why source audio is so important. Where is your audio coming from? What does it sound like going into the box, you know?
I'm excited. Tonight I'm going to be doing just exactly that, just playing with the compressor with the plug-in on, sort of to try to help me visualize some of this stuff and get a feel for what. I got a couple of different instruments that I play, you know, and I'd like to sort of have a feel like before I even plug them in to already know.
Right. You get a feel. Once you've done it for a while, you know, once you have an idea with different instruments, like I have a pretty good idea of where I'm going to set this or where that's going to be or where this is going to be. It's plus or minus, you know, and it's variable, but yeah, you do, you know that you sort of want this type of thing on a bass or that type of thing on a guitar. This, you know, the transients on drums are going to be really, you know, tough to deal with or whatever, you know, you're gonna have to deal with them in a specific way. In a bass, you're gonna want those long tones, you want it to be fuller. And guitar varies a lot because there's a wide range, in piano too, because some notes are bass, some are high, and it depends on the sound and the timbre. And But you do get a sense of what instruments, and then you use your ear to figure out the rest of it, right? So then you're like, okay, this is sort of where I think I should start. But this guy's playing real heavy here and real light here, or this girl, had this setting here and is using a different patch or effect or whatever, and it changes the sound here. And so I'll need to adapt accordingly,
Dude, thank you.
You're welcome, man. Yeah, enjoy that. I think that gives you a good overview of compression. And you're going to get a lot of mileage out of compression. You're going to see it a lot, even on your bass head, right? I mean, even on bass heads and amps, they have a compression setting. And what did it do before today? What did it do? What did you think it did? Who knows, right? But now you have a reference for what those settings mean and what you're looking for, what you want to hear. That's another big part of it is, what is it that I want to hear? What is it that's important to me in this sound? Is the bass frequency sound important? Am I playing chords? Am I backing them up? What is it that's important about this sound? What do I really want to hear? And then mix and compress and effect for that, for an end, have a goal in mind.
I'm trying to think of these TC heads, right? They have a compression and they call it something. It's some kind of, because it's a single knob compressor, right?
Yeah.
And
often with the single knob compressors, they'll have algorithms in there that change those settings according to where, so it's not just changing the threshold. It's not just changing one thing. It's you turn it up, and as you turn it up, the ratio, the knee, all of that is affected to a certain degree while you're doing that. I have other compressors that are the same. They're like one knob. I have some outboard stuff that has one knob compression, and that's what it does. And you can look in the specs and it tells you exactly what those ratios are, because there is an exact ratio. I mean, there is a number that it's doing. You just don't know exactly what it is. It kind of takes care of that for you. And it's great. It's very simple. It's user friendly, especially on a gig or on an amp, on a rig. You don't really need that much control, but now you can understand, what those settings are and what it might be doing when you hear those things like, oh, okay, I think it's increasing the ratio here. I think it's, the attack is a little bit faster now, or the threshold's a little bit lower, or whatever it is,
Certainly it definitely does something very different. Like at that very last, when you dime it out, like it's like doing something like very smoothly and evenly, but when you pass that final little notch, it totally did something, and I have no clue what it was.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's probably at that point limiting, you probably have it set, they internally probably have it set to an infinite ratio or 100 ratio, whatever it is. Essentially it's infinite. It does, different plugins, different companies call it different things, but essentially it's just as much ratio as you can, as much compression as you can possibly put on. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, very much.
Oh man. Well, have some fun with that and enjoy that, man. I appreciate your time today, man.
Dude, thank you. This is invaluable.
School of Rock. Santa Ana.